I'm Barry Devkinath Maharaj. You can visit learn.mo.gov.tt where you can find resources for ECCE, primary and secondary, where you help students connect and continue learning. So today we would be looking at primary science at standard 1 level, and the strand would be form and function, and the topic we would be looking at today would be simple machines. So we hear the term machine being used for everything. But what does it mean? What does it have to do with science? Or is it just a name? So a machine is anything used to make work easier. And that's why we use them, because it makes our life easier. Think about many years ago when there were caveman days. The life would be so hard because they didn't have all these tools and machines and cars and everyday household items. Each item that we actually use in our life and our everyday living is a form of a machine because it makes life easier. It makes work easier. And in science, we have to use the correct words, and in this case, we use the word work. So a machine is used to make work easier. So a simple machine is what we would be looking at, and a simple machine has just a few moving parts. As the word said, it's simple, it's not complex. So we are looking at basic types of machines here with just a few components. Work is done when a force moves an object. And just to recall, a force is a push or a pull. And when we apply a force or a push or a pull to an object, we would normally see some kind of effect happening. That effect that we see is work. So that work done is the effect of that force on the object. So work done is when a force moves an object. So examples of simple machines, we have levers, pulleys, wheel and an axle. And in our everyday lives, we come across these in so many different types and forms without even recognizing them. So let's look at a lever first. A lever is a simple machine. And a lever is actually very fun, not just a tool. A lever is a simple machine which consists of a rigid bar resting on a pivot. What's that in simple terms? What does that mean? Rigid means that it can't bend or bow. And a bar, it's a straight piece, and a pivot. A pivot is just a point. So if you have problems imagining what I'm talking about, think about the next time you go to a play park or the time that you went and you sat on a seesaw. A seesaw is a lever. And the part that you would be sitting on would be that rigid bar. Because if it wasn't rigid and you sat on it and your friend sits on the other end, if it wasn't rigid, that would bend and he would go to the ground and you would you remain in the ground. That would be no fun. So that bar must be rigid. And the part where it swings about in the middle is called the pivot. Sometimes you would hear another word called fulcrum. So we have words in science. We have load and we have effort. And that would tell us about the direction of the forces and where they go. The example that we are most familiar with would be a seesaw. When a force or effort is placed on the arm of a lever, so remember we have two ends. When the force is placed on one side, the load on the other side is moved. So if I'm sitting there on the seesaw by myself, I would be the load, and then a friend comes on and say, hey, can I sit on the seesaw with you? and he sits on the opposite end. So that force he applies on the other end would move that arm and move that load. And this is how it works. So now we would go to a next simple machine, which is called a pulley. And a pulley is quite common. It's a simple design. It's a wheel, and in between the wheel there's a groove, and on that groove we would pass a cord or a rope or a string, and it would rotate. And that's what we need to know. Remember, we said a wheel could spin and rotate. So what do we use a pulley for? A pulley is usually used to raise heavy loads or to change the direction of a load. So in our little diagram here, we are seeing a child, and this is a water well, and the water is way down beneath, and there's a bucket attached to a rope, and the rope goes around the wheel, goes down. So when the child pulls on the rope, the bucket, which was at the bottom of the well filled with water, which would be the load, would now go up, and you see the wheel would spin. So that's a very good example of a pulley. So a next example is raising a flag on a flagpole, and we see this every day in our schools when we raise the flag. And since this is a more common example that you would be more familiar with, the important point in that pulley is direction. When the person pulls down on the rope, they are pulling that force. That force is going down. But what direction does the flag on the other end of the rope goes? It goes up, in the opposite direction. So that's the next important thing you need to consider when we are looking at pulleys: direction. Our next simple machine would be a wheel and an axle. And think about how every day we get to and from different parts of the country, or any kind of transport, or simple like moving objects. A wheel and axle is a simple machine consisting of a grooved wheel turned by a cord or a chain with a rigid axle attached to them. So in this diagram, we have one wheel here, another wheel, and they are connected by rigid. And again, we need the word rigid, so when we apply the force would be transmitted to the other side. So we are now move on to our activity. For activity today, we would like to get assistance from Fritti and Arian. So our first activity is the pulley, but before we move on to the activity, the things that we used would be found in the Simple Machines kit, which was supplied to schools by Ministry of Education. So all the machines that we saw and more can be built using this kit in a combination and a variety of different activities for science. But today we are just using it to demonstrate these few. The lever system. So here we have our simple lever system, which is like a seesaw. We have our rigid bar and our pivot in the middle and our load and effort. So Arian, could you show us how? So if you notice, it does not bend because it's a rigid bar, and because of the loading, it could either, if it's heavy on one end, it would go that direction, and the other direction would go again, as we mentioned, in the opposite side. So here is balance. So this is an example of a lever. So now let's demonstrate a pulley system. So here, as we mentioned before, we have a wheel with a groove and a string passing through the groove. We have a load, we have an effort. The effort is where we pull. So if we notice, this is down, and if she pulled on that force down, so the load goes up. If she continues, it goes up in the opposite direction. So now, if the force is released, we'd have the reverse happening. And this is all happening in the change of direction depending on where the force is applied, which side is greater or not. So this is a demonstration of the pulley. So now we would have the wheel and an axle. But before we actually demonstrate the wheel and axle, since we are talking about forces, we would like to understand how easy it is when we have machines involved. Before we move on to the wheel and axle, let's see what would happen when we don't have a wheel and axle present. So as it is now, we have the block with a string, and we would need to move this block. So we would have to take the string and put a force and pull it. So drag it to the end. Yeah, just go. Don't stay. Stand still. Right. So if you notice that sound, and it looked a little bit difficult to move from one point to the other. So now we have the same block, but we added wheels and an axle to the same block. So what we would do now is to pull the same block and see if by adding wheels and axles, if the job becomes easier or not. So let's go. Okay, thank you. So if you noticed, take it and go on. If you notice, by adding the wheels and the axle, moving the block was such an easier job. So the wheel and axle had a big difference. Think about driving a car without wheels. We would take forever to go anywhere. So what did we learn? So we have a lever. It's used for lifting or moving heavy things by turning motion. Some examples are wheelbarrows, seesaw, a wheel and axle, how it works, transferring the force by rolling motion, bicycle, trucks, cars with the wheels. The pulley helps raise or lower a load or change the direction the load moves. And examples, flags and a bucket from the ground to the floor. So at this point in time, I would like to thank Vritti and Aryan for your assistance. Thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of our topic of machines, and I hope you had fun, because science is fun.